The title of this presentation, The Regenerative Nationalism of Robert Mangaliso, arises out of the fact that the essentials, the core ideas underlying his nationalism, long after he died, remain with us as crucial and as vital as they were originally formulated. In order for us to understand and locate his contributions more aptly, it is important to look at this concept, nationalism. It's a concept which currently is regarded as almost a dirty word in some circles. In other circles, it is to be praised. It is praised. In other words, it means different things to different people. Now, why is this so? We see that, for example, if you look around the world currently, in places like Hungary, Ireland, and Spain, it is regarded with suspicion globally. And yet, in a place like Ireland, for the past 200 years, the idea of nationalism has always been an ideal for the masses of the people. We see that in Germany, nationalism today is a dirty word because of its associations with Hitler and the period that saw the rise of Hitler and the terrible things that he did. So also it is with the idea that fascism in Italy, the word fascism was coined by Mussolini, that they did terrible things, not only to Italy, but to the rest of the world, because of the type of nationalism that they proposed. So also, it is said of Spain, that Franco's Spain was a fascist. In other words, one thing we can say for certain is that in history, the nationalisms that have been right-wing, the nationalisms that have been associated with the political right, have tended to be fascist, very repressive, and in time associated with all the negatives that you can think of. The nationalism that is associated with the left tells another story. It tells the story of countries like Vietnam, of countries like China, of countries like Soviet Russia, of countries like Cuba, and also not so far to the left, there are those countries, like most of the countries we've seen in Africa, which have been moderately left. The whole struggle against imperialism and colonialism in Africa has been executed largely from a leftist direction, but purely with nationalist programs purely with nationalist programs, national objectives. Now, we use the term nationalism also in a sense that it has been used since the 19th century. That is, states which recognize the sovereignty of the people, which recognize themselves as belonging to some borders, as having a certain character, having certain interests as states, and representing themselves as states. Since the 1860s, particularly, they emerged. And they emerged with the unification of Germany, for example, the emergence of Italy at the same time in the 1860s, and the struggle of the Irish, the beginning of the struggle of the Irish against British domination, etc. And also in Africa, in 1868, the emergence of the first organization of Africans wanting to appear modern, unified, and declaring their interests as a nation, the Fanta Confederacy of 1868. Now, it is against this background for us of struggles against imperialism and colonialism that nationalism in Africa has largely been exhibited. But it has come also as part of a larger program, a program of nationalism enunciated largely by people of African descent from outside Africa, from the West Indies and from the United States. People say that you don't see Africa whole until you are out of it. Because when you are standing outside, so they say that because the African descendants who were out of Africa could see Africa whole. Their idea of Africa was a Pan-Africanist idea, an idea which grouped the whole of Africa together. And so nationalism, the first ideas of nationalism in Africa, were largely linked to the diaspora, directly to the diaspora. And in that instance, in fact, in South Africa, there is the distinct historical fact that the person who used the term Pan-African first is a lawyer called Henry Sylvester Williams, who organized the first Pan-Africanist Association meeting at the turn of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. Henry Sylvester was also the first African descendant lawyer who was registered in the Cape Bar at the beginning of the 20th century. In Cape Town, he was the first African descendant registered in the Cape Bar at the end of the beginning of the 20th century. Henry Sylvester Williams. He coined the term Pan-African. And it is interesting also to note that he said most of the evidence that he got prior to the meeting was from a South African woman who was married to a Scottish man and who would spend time in the Rand area, the goldfields, the Rand goldfields area. Anyway, fast forward to Sobukwe. In the vexing and perplexing times that we as Africans find ourselves today, Sobukwe's legacy represents an undying beacon of hope, a beckoning guide for a brighter future ahead. Sacrifice in service of of the emancipation of the African masses in racist South Africa has enduringly elevated his memory in the hearts and minds of the African people in particular, and in general the disadvantaged humanity of the world. Sobukwe passed with lung cancer on the 27th February 1978. He was born in 1924 to hard-working but impecunious parents as one of the 4 surviving children of a doting mother and a disciplinarian father, who, although had left school after the 5th grade, treasured and valued education and endeavored to instill in his children a love for reading. He was brought up in a Methodist Christian household which took its Christianity seriously. Sunday church attendance was de rigueur, and this household culture of Christian moralism, built on patently African values, registered indelibly in the character and makeup of Mangaliso Sobukwe. The fundamental Christian principle of social justice and reverence for human dignity marked his social practice. His love for intellectual cultivation guided him with impeccable records through Hilltown and Fort Hare. He entered Hilltown in 1940. His school friend Makai Vazani describes him as a notably voracious reader. He was reading books like Baronet Ox's books, Dickens's The Tale of Two Cities, and he was eloquent about other famous prose writers. Sobukwe had a particular love for poetry, we're told. Zani remembered that there were special passages in Gray's elegy that he often repeated. We are told he excelled in tennis and loved the music of Mozart and Brahms. Already at Hilltown, he displayed very generous qualities of empathy, sense of duty, devotion, and sensitivity. He came out of Hilltown with a first-class matric certificate and went on to Fort Hare in 1947 and graduated in 1950. At Fort Hare, he was sometime president of the SRC, the Student Representative Council. He was most fortunate to have married well. His loyal and devoted wife, Sondeni Veronica Sobukwe, who he married in 1954, was a trained nurse, an eldest daughter of Mate family of Klobani in KZN, one of the sites of the Anglo-Boer Wars. By her own account, it was love at first sight. She died at 91 in 2018. She was a modest, reliable, steadfast, and loyal partner. Many attest to the fact that the prime feature of her rock-like personality was that she was a stickler who had no time for silliness. She was serious in temperament and did not suffer fools gladly. She had no time for loose talk and empty talk, a no-nonsense person. She was designated Madame or Ma Prof by the younger generation in acknowledgement to her illustrious husband. She kept faith with her husband's memory and commitment, and abidingly held on to her husband's position that not until the day of the resurrection would he abrogate his commitment to the Pan-African cause. The racist colonial settler regime had hoped to undermine her devotion to her husband through the repetitive renewals of his imprisonment orders. They failed. They failed dismally. In all the years of his imprisonment, she understood too well that the intention of the apartheid regime was to extinguish her resolve, shatter the supportive partnership, and thus remove the mortal threat her husband represented to the continuation of racist rule. Sunday Nimate remained politically unwavering until the final day of her passing at the ripe old age of 91, and was buried next to her husband in a grave they had reserved for herself next to her husband. After the passing of her husband in 1978, she was ejected out of their house. So she went to stay in the family house of the husband. The children were helped. They went to the US, where they were helped or assisted by Andrew Young, who was then the American ambassador to the United Nations and a close associate of Martin Luther King. In the rich, eventful, and checkered political history of Southern Africa in the 20th century, in many respects, in both theory and practice, Sobukwe's ideas, life's work, and legacy shine radiantly, profilingly a supremely towering and unrivaled figure. A happy warrior in the cause of African freedom in South Africa, he, by sustained consistence and composed inspiration, faced down the wrath of the infernal apartheid machine, never allowing them to psychologically intimidate or get the better of him. He maintained throughout his life moral superiority above the vile ruses and malevolent attacks of the racist state. Sobukwe never submitted to racist fascism of the National Party. For this, he suffered the fate of a hounded, righteous person, uncowed and unbowed by the iniquity and venality of his detractors, and achieved martyrdom in the cause of the emancipation and freedom of South Africa. Sealed intent and purpose, preferring lucidity, directness, unambiguity, and expression free from pointless or rhetorical gimmickry and political imposition. His abiding psychological resilience and steadfastness of purpose rested on an assiduously cultivated self-discipline and an unending love for Africa and Africans, the people for whose lot he devoted his life and voice to the end of his days. Time and again, he would remind his audience of the need to resolutely commit themselves to the African cause. By the time he left Fort Hare, his political voice was already adeptly honed. In the valedictory address he presented on behalf of his outgoing class in 1949, he exhibited this adeptness with these words, and I quote, "A word to those who are remaining behind. You have seen by now that what education means to us. The identification of ourselves with the masses. Education to us means service to Africa. In whatever branch of learning you are there for Africa. You have a mission. We all have a mission. A nation to build we have. A God to glorify. A contribution clear to make towards the blessing of mankind. We must be the embodiment of our people's aspirations. And all we are required to do is to show the light, and the masses will find the way. Watch our movements keenly, and if you see any sign of quote-unquote broad-mindedness or reasonableness, quote-unquote, in us, or if you hear us talk of practical experiences as a modifier of man's views, denounce us as traitors to Africa, unquote. This was the language of a dedicated man who at 25 was speaking with the trenchancy and perspicacity of a person at least twice his age. Years ago, in 1970, Patrick Lawrence of the Star newspaper in Johannesburg interviewed him in Kimberley, and he pointed out that a distinctive feature of his persona at that point in time was an aura of dignity, of self-dignity, personal dignity. The calm and profound of conviction, calmness and profoundness of conviction. There is a gentleness about him, he says. Not the gentleness of meek, but that of a man who knows he does not have to shout. Within and beyond it are a passionate conviction in an iron world. Though he's a man of great intellectual vigor, and a bedrock of his strength is his faith, belief in the slow but inexorable advance of nationalism, confidence in the future, buttressed by a particular view of the past, his continued commitment to Pan-Africanism, even after all these years of isolation and political quarantine, have been acknowledged by some of his staunchest political enemies, unquote. That was Patrick Lawrence. Pogren, Benjamin Pogren, who did a lot of work also on his line, makes a similar point. It was only, quote, it was only obvious that he had not the slightest regret about his actions, but he remained dedicated to African nationalism and Pan-Africanism and to gaining freedom for blacks. What here needs to be added and affirmed is that his faith in the ultimate destination of African nationalism, alluded to by Lawrence, was not based on eschatological grounds, myth, and belief, but understanding of rational social processes and historical calculus. It's not based on a semi-religious, although he was a religious person. His understanding of the dynamics of society informed him that inevitably this is the direction in which things will go. He held time-tested conclusions and convictions, grounded in humane values and advised by the logic of incontrovertible practicalities of history. Taking constant parts of the African constituency, conceding the obvious, and moving with the tenor of the period, he succeeded in reflecting the popular aspirations of the hoi polloi and was an active political pace-setter for a good part of the latter 20th century. He was loved and cherished as the embodiment of unflattering African resistance and tenacity in the face of relentless settler colonial dehumanization of the aboriginals of the country, who he frequently referred to, as I quote, the sons, daughters of Africa. He was never out of date, never stale. His ideological relevance lifted us to the present. Therefore, his Africanist views are regenerative. They resurface. They revitalize themselves. They reassert themselves. They reappear, and they will continue to reappear. Self-perpetuating at the core. He loved youth and the promise they held. They are enthusiastic emblems and accepted and encouraged its exigencies. For the youth and his teeming admirers, he was Prof, the sobriquet, which served as an abbreviated but loaded identification of profound endearment and the respect they fervently paid to his vindicated political clout and undisputed intellectual prowess. Sobukwe's dauntless determination was conceptually framed and fashioned through the most embracing avant-gardist conception of African emancipation in the 20th century. That is Pan-Africanism. The idea, the notion that only the unity of African people will ensure the emancipation and development of Africans. It is indeed educative to note that for over a century, no single idea or intellectual recipe for African emancipation and development of people of African descent has been as influential and all-embracing as the thought and practice of African politics as a clutch of ideas expressed in the Pan-Africanist argument. In brief, the argument is that the future of Africa and Africans must lie in the hands of Africans. Pan-Africanism is an affirmative and assertive statement of African humanity, a spirit of indomitability, a vindication of African resistance to imperialism, colonial and neo-colonial, an attestation of the right and willingness of Africans to unite and seize their equality amongst humankind. It is not a dogma cast in stone by a political pedigree, which requires uncontested doctrinal fidelity every time it is called into analytical or practical service. It is conceptually a dynamic frame of reference which responds to changes in focus and relevance according to ceaselessly changing historical realities. The term, as I already said, was originally coined by Henry Sylvester Williams, the Trinidadian jurist and political activist who, in the opening years of the 20th century, spent time in Cape Town as a lawyer. In 1903, he came to practice as a barrister in South Africa, becoming the first African descendant to be called to the Cape Bar in the Cape Colony, the then Cape Colony. In slow distillation and evolution, much of the development of Pan-Africanist thought was achieved under the stewardship of W.E.B. Du Bois, particularly in the interwar period. In the 1920s, Marcus Garvey globalized the thought in all corners of the world through the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNEA. In South Africa, Garvey's ideas became a staring fillip to ideas of African resistance to settler colonialism and imperial domination. Indeed, Walter Sisulu makes reference to this in his own recollections as they appear in the book written by his daughter-in-law, Eleanor Sisulu, about how a chap called Wellington Buthelezi, who was from this corner of South Africa, had regurgitated Garvey's views to them and told them that there were African-American troops coming, who were coming by air to fight, and so, of course, it was not true. There was no truth in that. So he gentleman called Wellington Buthelezi. Now, Pan-Africanism as a social transformative formula in the second half of the 20th century adapted to the realization that post-colonialism, the way it has unfolded in Africa in the last century, has in fact delivered no political nirvana, but rather been effectively a transit to neocolonialism. Till today, we can say without fear of contradiction that Pan-Africanism remains the only credible route to deeper and fuller African emancipation. Pan-Africanism was the chosen formula in Sobukwe's incandescent vision of an emergent Africa. In Southern Africa, before and after him, nobody has equaled the zeal and conviction with which he nailed his colors to the mast of the Pan-Africanist ideal, with no room for misinterpretation or equivocation. Sobukwe professed that, and I quote, "We who are Pan-African in outlook do not subscribe to the doctrine of South African exceptionalism and are committed to Pan-Africanism and a union of African states, which we would like to see as a unitary, centrally controlled organic whole," unquote. He was a man of in South Africa, he set standards in political theory and practice with which all subsequent politicians going forward will have to be measured. Post-Second World War Africa had announced in Manchester in 1945 from the Fifth Pan-African Congress the course towards colonial freedom in Africa. Within a decade, Africans were at the portals of post-colonialism. Africans were knocking on the door to colonial freedom. The All African Peoples Conference, held in Accra in December 1958, placed the agenda of the route to colonialism and settler colonialism on notice. I was there. I was a youngster, about 14 years old. I was an usher. It was a meeting which all the big names of post-colonial Africa were present, including the now late Kenneth Kaunda, Hastings Banda, Kamuzu Banda, Tom Mboya, Shirley Graham, was the wife of Du Bois. Du Bois himself was not there. Frantz Fanon, and Patrice Lumumba, and Holden Roberto of Angola. All these people were present. A year later, Sobukwe created the PAC. Exactly a year later, and there was a lot of feedback between the secretariat of that organization. I remember, I'm digressing a bit from my script, but sometimes you have to do so, especially if some of the facts are facts which you know personally. One of the people I have met in my life, in fact it was in 1970s, about 1976, about 2-3 weeks after the Soweto uprising. I met John Gana from South Africa. He stayed with me in Gaborone. And he was part of the Betel 18, subsequently part of the Betel 18 trial. He was the number 2 accused. He told me that at the time they founded the PAC, soon afterwards, the chap who was then the director of the Bureau of African Affairs in Accra was the first chap from West Africa they infiltrated into Soweto with a bag, a suitcase of money, PAC there. That was from the secretariat of the people who came out of the All African People's Congress of 1958. And that man was a chap called Ekobadan, who I later met also. He was hounded out of Ghana because of politics, and he became a refugee in Uganda, and I ran into him and got Mangani to help him with some funding. At that time later when he became exiled in Britain, but I digressed a bit too much. Sobukwe's writing and speeches, which have come to us, reveal the mind of a politically astute and superlatively informed intellect on the Pan-Africanist reading and lore of his times. He was extremely familiar with the contemporary global Africanist ideas. His speeches and writings are littered with references and citations from Garvey, Nkrumah, Du Bois, Padmo, Azikiwe, Nyerere, Banda, Kaunda, Mboya, Kenyatta, and others. Blyden and later Garvey's Africa for the Africans, Blyden's African personality, Nkrumah's positive action, and the Freedom Salute were digested features arising out of the Secretariat of the Pan-Africanist Congress in the 50s. It's been observed that there is a certain pathos at the heart of the story of neglect that Robert Sobukwe had suffered in South African political history. Especially so since the advent of democracy in 1994. It seems that he is remembered in a few street names, and such so that he can be quickly forgotten. And yet, Sobukwe and his ideas refuse to be removed from the fabric of everyday consciousness, as though their ghostly presence haunts our political conscience. In the 1960s, Sobukwe was thought by many in and out of South Africa to hold the answers to the route to liberation in South Africa in the 60s. Even more so than the giant of South African politics, Nelson Mandela. By the end of the decade, he had been decisively eclipsed and with speed removed from the immediate scene of political play. The potential in the scene Sobukwe had set was tactically squandered through the ineptitude of the PAC in exile. But Lako Lebalo's leadership in difficult and trying circumstances had not been able to hold the emergent and persistent factions together. A concert of international backers and interests strategically preferred the alternative solutions offered by the ANC. The road to strategic united front was closed by the South African Communist Party elements who dominated the ANC and the tactical incompetence of the PAC leadership outside the country, with both sides pushing the politics of an abstract idea of winner takes all Marxism. Both the PAC and ANC got sucked into the big power rivalries of the Cold War era, trading in flighty rhetorical maneuvers which bore little resemblance to the evolving reality on the ground. From the Poco era to the end of apartheid, considerable sacrifices were made by PAC structures inside the country. After Sobukwe, Zef Mutuping held the inspirational line. The Bedell 18 trial, 1978, was a marker in this history. The number one accused of the Bedell 18 trial was Zef Mutuping. He was affectionately called the Lion of Azania. Sobukwe's most senior colleagues in South Africa from the foundation of the PAC, also charged with Zef Mutuping, were other prison graduates from Robben Island, like my friend, the man I knew, John Ganya, who was number 2 accused, Shinners, Keke, and many others. From the closing years of the 60s and the opening years of the 70s, Sobukwe's stature and ideas, the ideas he offered, had been studiously demoted as the PAC was convulsed and consumed by internecine wrangling. At home, Sobukwe's sacrifices were systematically discounted and consistently sidelined in the popular historiography and narratives of the anti-apartheid struggle. In effect, from the time he was jailed for 9 years altogether, including a 6-year period of near-complete solitary confinement on Robben Island, Sobukwe was muzzled as a political voice. He could not be quoted. With the demise of apartheid, his legacy has been underplayed, quietly avoided, a condition that has been extended into the present period. This has happened to such an extent that we can say that Sobukwe was better known during apartheid than after apartheid. Sipho Shabalala reminds us that, quote, nowhere in the country can Sobukwe's voice be heard. His voice was feared by the settler colonial regime, and it is feared by the post-colonial regime. Mangaliso Sobukwe has been silenced. But soon the people are going to demand to hear his voice. Unquote. This is Sipho Shabalala. Shabalala presses his point home with the observation that, and I quote again, Sobukwe has been rendered non-iconic, someone who did not suffer as much as the recognized icons, unquote. The clarity and nobility of his ideas on racial prejudice were already in place before he left Fort Hare. His 1949 valedictory included the following telling observations. I quote, "We will watch you too," talking to his mates. Quote, "We will watch you too. We have been reminded time and again that fellows who, while at college, were radicals, as soon as they got outside, became spineless stooges and screeching megaphones of white heron-folkism, or else became disgruntled and disillusioned objects of pity. My contention is, those fellows were never radicals. They were anti-white. And as Marcus Garvey says, you cannot grow beyond your own thoughts. It is too exacting. It warps the mind. This is why we preach the doctrine of love for Africa. We can never do enough for Africa, nor can we love her enough. The more we do for her, the more we wish to do. sure that I'm speaking for the whole of young Africa when I say that we are prepared to work with any man who is fighting for the liberation of Africa within our lifetime, unquote. This was his valedictory. This was part of his valedictory. Indeed, the memory of Robert Sobukwe, inspiration political leader of the first president of the PAC, has been studiously overlooked and sometimes at best grudgingly acknowledged in post-apartheid South Africa. But the vitality and relevance of his views reverberate with persistence. You can never force a piece of cork permanently underwater, however much you try. Surely, as day follows night, and the hour is approaching when his name and his ideas will reverberate through the streets of South Africa. Now, I do not want to bore you further with the origins of the PAC, the narrative of the origins, but I'd like to look at what happened to him after he served his sentence, the particularity of some of the attention the venal apartheid machine directed at him. Between 1963 and 1969, he spent 6 years of near complete solitary confinement on Robben Island. During his extended incarceration, he was separated from all other inmates and endured solitary confinement during 6 more years of systematized psychological warfare. This draconian clause, the Sobukwe clause, exceptional in its severity and evil in import, was meant for no one else but Sobukwe. It was throughout the 6 years annually routinely reinstated by the Minister of Justice. This fascist judicial instrument has before then and after never been used to incarcerate anybody else. It means the apartheid state was terrified of this man. They were petrified of what he could eventually achieve. He was more a threat than any other South African leader. Indeed, Sobukwe was never a free man again after his 1960 imprisonment. When he was released from the confinement of Robben Island in 1969, the apartheid government foisted a spate of vindictive administrative measures to break his resolve. They failed, but his health had suffered grievously. They forced him into internal exile in Kimberley. Sobukwe's ideas represent a strand in Africanist thought in South Africa, which can be differently historically placed and has appeared at different junctures in history, and this is important. This is important because it starts for Pixley, but it was later on revamped by Anton Lebede as the cornerstone of the foundation of the ANC Youth League. in 1944. The emergence of the Youth League in 1944 was clear expression of the militant Africanism of the time. It included Lembede, but also Mandela, Sisulu, and Ashby Mda, and later on other people, William Ngoi and Maskela and Duma Nokwe, William Nkomo, and many others. Now, Lembede's nationalism set tone and marked the outline of what was to follow and appear in Sobukwe. To understand Sobukwe, you must understand Lembede. Now, Biko was later to reaffirm the Africanist argument with Black consciousness, the Black consciousness movement. Again, it's the same strand of nationalist thoughts which appeared from the beginning of the 20th century. Now, it simmered on in the 60s. By the late 60s, in 1969, it was threatening to boil over. The Black consciousness movement was then ascendant. In 1975, in Morogoro, that same tendency, that same Africanist tendency, was in 1975, Morogoro, Tanzania, the ANC, under the influence of the South African Communist Party, had a full-blown confrontation with the Africanist tendency within its ranks. 8 of its senior members, known as the ANC African Nationalists, were kicked out of the organization. They included Jonas Matlow, who I knew very well. In fact, he stayed with me in Zambia. And Tammy Bonga, A.K. Mkota, George Mbele, Tennyson Makiwane, Ambrose Makiwane, Pascal Ngakane, etc. Lapero. Now, these guys were kicked out. Now, it's the same tendency again, same tradition again, which is pushed aside. So, what it points to, and it's the same tradition as emerged in Biko's Black Nationalist movement, is that you cannot, it is not a tradition which you can suppress forever. It's like a cork in water. You press it down and it comes up again. Because it is the living, is the heart of the crisis of the African people, of the oppression of the African. So long as that, what it represents is not addressed, it will not vanish. It will keep coming back. That's the important point about that sort of nationalism. And it extends into Pan-Africanism. It's the same thing is true for the rest of Africa. So the Pan-Africanist solution for Africa is vital for the further emancipation and advancement of the African people. So long as we don't allow it, we try to block it, we fend it off, we think we can push it on the side, it'll come up again because it's part of the aspirations of the progress of the people, the masses of the people. That's the point that needs to be made. But Lembede's exposition of these ideas are interesting, of this tradition, the position he took on it. And I quote, "The history of modern times is the history of nationalism. Nationalism has been tested in people's struggles and the fires of battle and found to be the only effective weapon, the only antidote against foreign rule and modern imperialism. It is for this reason that the great imperialist powers feverishly endeavor with all their might to discourage and eradicate nationalist tendencies amongst their alien subjects. For that purpose, huge and enormous sums of money are lavishly expended on propaganda against nationalism, which is dubbed and designated as, quote, narrow, barbarous, uncultured, devilish, etc. Some alien subjects become dupes of this sinister propaganda and consequently become tools or instruments of imperialism, for which great service they are highly praised and extolled and eulogized by the imperialist powers and showered with such epithets as, quote, cultured, liberal, progressive, broad-minded, etc. All over the world, nationalism is rising in revolt against foreign domination, against conquest and oppression in India, in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Persia, and several other countries. Amongst Africans, also clear signs of national awakening, national renaissance, or rebirth are noticeable on the far-off horizon. A new spirit of African nationalism or Africanism is pervading through and stirring the African society. A young, virile nation is in the process of birth and emergence. The national movement imbued with and animated by the national spirit is gaining strength and momentum. The African National Congress Youth League is called upon to aid and participate in this historical process. This was from an extract from a speech he made in 1946. Now, it's also the Lembede's broadside. You remember his critique of broad-mindedness is repeated by Sobukwe. The same words are used by Sobukwe. Lembede explains further, and I quote again, Africa is a black man's country. Africans are the natives of Africa, and they have inhabited Africa, their motherland, from times immemorial. Africa belongs to them. 2. Africans are one. Out of the heterogeneous tribes, there must emerge a homogeneous nation. The basis of national unity is the nationalistic feeling of Africans, the feeling of being African, irrespective of tribal connection, social status, educational attainment, or economic class. 3. The leader of the Africans will come from their own loins. No foreigner can ever be a true, genuine leader of African people, because no foreigner can ever truly and genuinely interpret the African spirit, which is unique and peculiar to Africans only. Some foreigners, Asiatic or European, who pose as African leaders must be categorically denounced and rejected. An African must lead Africans. 4. Cooperation between Africans and other non-Europeans on common problems and issues may be highly desirable. 5. The divine destiny of the African people is national freedom. Unless Africans achieve national freedom, or as early as possible, they will be confronted with the impending doom and imminent catastrophe of extermination. 6. Africans must aim at balanced progress or advancement. We must guard against the temptation of lopsided or one-sided progress. 7. After national freedom, then socialism. Africans are naturally socialistic, as illustrated in their social practices and customs. The achievement of national liberation will therefore herald or usher in a new era of African socialism. Our immediate task, however, is not socialism, but national liberation. Unquote. Now, again, I will leave out a chart of what is the point one would like to make at this point is that we see, one, that there is consistency of Africanism from the beginnings of the African nationalist project, from the beginning of the 20th century. There's always been this trend. Now, it has been halted persistently. It's been arrested persistently, but it has always come back. Now, the question we face is it over? Do we think the solutions of the present Africa as a whole, and I'm not talking about any particular country, represents the final destination of the struggles of the masses of the people of Africa? That's the question we face. I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think that the essential issues which people like Seme and Mbede, and Sobukwe, and Biko have emphasized, have been addressed. And until they are addressed, there will be no end to this phase of the struggle. I will close my presentation. It's been a bit too long.